Wiggle, 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 wiggle.
Glen Vaudrey is an archaeologist. His specialization is in castle fields. That are fields with castles in them, making them castle fields by definition, because they have castles in them and they are fields, hence castle fields. He is here today to talk about his latest archaeological dig, which is in Pimlico, and he has been digging up a castle field in Pimlico, and he has found quite a collection of items. He has found a spoon, 2 biros and a pencil. And he is here to talk about the spoon, the 2 biros and a pencil. Glen Vaudrey and his castle field findings.
Well, nice to see everybody. I'd just like to say first, anybody who donated to trail cams, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. I'll try and catch up with you later. Right, just trying to work out how this works now. Am I in control of the pictures? Right, we're talking today about the waterhorse, the mythical creature of Mainland. I'm going to be talking about the one from Scottish mythology. Also, taking a trip off to the Faroe Islands, mainly because I've been writing about it for a book. Right, the first thing, I'm going to refer to it as the waterhorse. Now, that's just me being lazy. It goes by any number of names. These are just a few I've come across. The first one is the Yak Ish, I believe. I'm sure Ronan will tell me what it is.
Ishka.
Ishka. It's how it's told by somebody on the Isle of Lewis. And they claim it's different up there, but that's Lewis for you.
Well, on the Isle of Lewis, they speak a strange form of that.
It's a very strange form, especially after a few drinks. It also goes by the name of the Kelpie, the Noggle, the Niggle, and various versions of Nigel. Also known, for some bizarre reason, of the Shoe Puttle. And I suspect when it comes to talk to you, it will go under the name of Dobbing. It will be very fond, possibly of sugar lumps, best not give it any oats. This fearsome beast is possibly the most generic looking waterhorse you can come across. It's not a fearsome creature. It stands there, it attracts your attention with those big, possibly big eyes that you can't really see. Having been accosted by a bunch of Shetland ponies, they are scary beasts when you come up close. Anything that can be that size and waddle across to you, looking for food, is not to be trusted. And certainly that's the case with the waterhorse. The waterhorse would appear as a friendly animal offering you a lift. If you were foolish enough to climb aboard the horse and go for a ride, this is what would happen to you. For the waterhorse is a vicious carnivore that specialises in eating the foolish. It would first, you would climb onto the horse, you would find you stick to it. You're not just talking a leather saddle on a warm day. You are really talking sticking to it like glue. It would then proceed to the nearest watercourse, drag you into it, where it would then reveal its true form, which is more like that. Certainly not the happy little creature that you thought you were riding. Certainly not something you want to be sharing a bath with. And certainly not something that's looking after you in a deep pond. When a waterhorse is finished with you, or its victim, it would generally just leave the odd floaty bit. Now, I'm pretty sure this is a liver. I think it is anyway. But it wasn't. That's what generally would wash up after you've fallen into the water. The next day, the friendly village folk, your family, or anybody who just happened to be going fishing, would find such as a liver floating up on the surface. But it was actually any kind of bloody offal would serve. Some waterhorses, your lungs would float to the surface to be found on the beach. Other waterhorses, it would be your heart and lungs would float up. Interestingly enough, if your heart, your liver and your lungs floated up, you're pretty much on your way to creating a haggis. Now, for all your waterhorse types, you would think it was a horse. Now, from our little selection up there, we have, peering over the fence, a cheeky waterhorse. Lower down, we have a small red-headed waterhorse. The story goes that in the Highlands, they were trying to drain a loch. The idea was that if you got the water out, you could claim the waterhorse that was living deep inside it. So the men in the village start to drain the pond, the loch. They don't get very far before an apparition turns up. It's a short, red-headed, angry, little dwarf waterhorse man. Staggers up to them. As soon as they see that strange-looking gentleman, they run off. As you can tell, the waterhorse does seem to have some very strange forms. Our next in line is a creepy little old lady. The number of times the creepy little old lady turns up at some small hovel, asks for somewhere to stay at night before being a most rude guest. But I'll tell you more about that a little later. Finally, we have the Highland gent. The waterhorse, while being a vicious and carnivorous beastie, also had a few other traits. One of these was its tendency to be responsible for fathering illegitimate children. A number of times, some fair damsel in the village would suddenly appear with child, and in best tradition of these small villages, would blame it on a passing waterhorse. Today's equivalent would be the person going to the CSA and saying the father kept his crash helmet on. So we'll go on to have a look at some of the sites that we've got locations for reports. This lovely looking area of the Monarch Islands, the Isle of Lewis, Isle of Harris, I think it's actually South Uist off. Lovely looking islands, completely deserted today. At one time there was a population living on. It would be a mainly fishing and crofting community, but they had one problem. From outside the main settlement, the Loch of Virtues was a waterhorse. This waterhorse plagued the area. It would nip out, drag people off into the water. Did nothing for the tourist industry. Bad enough going and putting your towel on the sand, find your towel missing, but fancy lying on your towel and being dragged into the water. The villagers, understandably, were getting fed up with this waterhorse. They were deciding whether to abandon the isle and leave it to the beast. Instead of that, a woman called MacLeod decided she had a plan, that she'd secretly been breeding a large bull. This was the most fearsome bull on the whole island. It had been trained to fight a waterhorse. The villagers thought, worth a try, so they sent for a bull. It races down to the beach, stares at the water. It starts snorting away, scruffing up the sand with its hooves, bellowing. The waterhorse eventually gets the hint, climbs out of his watery lair to face the bull. The bull instantly charges at the waterhorse, pushing it about, sticking its hooves in. It looks like the day's up for the waterhorse. But the waterhorse is a devious creature. Realising that its strength does not lie on land, it starts to retreat backwards into the water. The bull, not known as the world's wisest of animals, thinks it's winning, starts to follow the waterhorse into the water. Before too long, the two animals were in the water, surrounded by spray. Every now and again we'd see a hoof, maybe an ear, a horn, and then suddenly, nothing. Nobody knew who'd won. The next day, however, a badly damaged set of lungs float up onto the surface and drift ashore. Considering what the waterhorse has a tendency to leave behind, you would have to think the bull lost. Our next location is a place called a sheeling. A sheeling is a rough hut based on one of the moors in Lewis. Today they are mainly garden sheds that have been dumped out on the moors. Look like nice little fishing shacks, somewhere to escape from the town and looking after your sheep. However, a traditional sheeling looked like this hovel. And it certainly is a hovel. A single door in, a small bed made out of reeds or rushes that would be lay on the ground, possibly sharing it with a cow or two. Not the most pleasant of places, but it did keep you out of the rain. And believe me, it does rain there. This story takes place in a sheeling outside the village of Shawboss on the Isle of Lewis. It concerns the tale of Fair Mary and Dark Mary. I take it was Dark Mary because she had dark hair and for no reason than that. However, Fair Mary and Dark Mary are sent out to the sheeling to look after the cattle one evening. It's summer, it's rather nice. They sat there minding their own business, doing whatever people do at sheelings, when they see a little old lady walking towards them. At first they're very suspicious because we've never seen this little woman before. She comes up to them, but she looks desperate. She's in need of help. She asks them, "Can I come into a little sheeling tonight?" Initially, they're a bit suspicious of her. Where have they come from? Oh, she's from the area. She knows the location. She knows a lot about the loch. That seems good enough to Fair Mary. Seems good enough to Dark Mary. So they ask if she'd like to come into the house of a sheeling. So a little old lady crawls into the sheeling, and that night all three of them settle down for a good night's sleep. During the night, Dark Mary wakes up. There's something wet. Fearing, of course, we've invited an incontinent old woman into the sheeling, she's not expecting too much, turns round and finds the old woman has gone. She looks around a bit further and finds Fair Mary dead, eaten by some creature. Running out of the sheeling, she looks down the loch, and instead of seeing a little old lady walking away, she sees a pony trotting off towards the water. It had been a waterhorse all along. After that day, the sheelings at Shawboss were never used again, and the area became known as a sheeling of one night. Our next location, we're heading off to Shetland, a place called Bourvos. A gentleman by the name of Hutchinson once came across a waterhorse. Now, the Isle of Shetland is indeed known for a number of waterhorse stories. This could have taken place in the last couple of 100 years. It's certainly implied that it was sometime in the 18th century, if it took place at all. The gentleman knows of the danger of waterhorses and the fact that they do have a tendency to be seen in the area. And whatever you do not climb on the waterhorse. You can feed it carrots, you can feed it sugar lumps, you can give it directions, but don't climb on a waterhorse. However, on this night, it was dark, it was cold, it was wet. It was probably August. He sees his pony trot towards him. He's walking along, maybe winking at him, maybe happily brushing against him, flashing an eyelash, who knows. As he gets further towards his destination, the weather gets worse, his bags get heavier, He's not liking this journey at all. So, foolishly, he decides, I'm going to get on top of the horse. So he climbs on, makes himself comfortable, and the horse sets off. So far, so good. He's heading off towards his preferred direction. But as he's going along, you notice the horse is pulling to one side. He's pulling towards the water. As he starts off, he starts to pull gently, doesn't matter. A bit further on, he's dragging him towards the water, but he's still fighting it back. Eventually, the water horse gets its way and drags him towards the water. He may have been a foolish man, but he was a lucky man, because he jumps off the water horse just before it hits the water. He knows it's a water horse because as soon as it hits the water, it disappears in a blinding blue flash of flame. And that was the end of his encounter. But Shetland also had another kind of water horse. This was the Nuggle. It was a specialised water horse that lived around water wheels. It was the industrial water horse. This is the best picture I could find of a traditional water mill in Shetland. Not the most inspiring of places, lots of dark places where a water horse could hide. The way the water horse would hunt, it would look for a mill with a fat miller. Got to be a big bone miller, got to get a good meal. It would then, and this is the bit that takes some believing, head towards the spinning wheel, where it would then bite hold of the wheel and stop it spinning. The water horse has been described as having fearsome teeth. Some would say dreadful teeth. The prospect of catching hold of a spinning water wheel with your teeth would indeed be dreadful. Any dentist will tell you not to try it. Once the wheel has stopped, the miller, understandably concerned, rushes out. He goes down to the mill base and he sees that his wheel has stopped. He cannot see anything at all near his wheel. But how strange is this? A pony comes up to him. No one said these millers were right. Why he should come out and think, bugger, my wheel has stopped, I must go for a ride, is never quite explained. However, for reasons best known to himself, the miller would climb onto the horse and never be seen again, dragged off to the depths to disappear in a blue haze. Now, we take a trip to another island, this time on the Isle of Raasay, which is just off the Isle of Skye. So just find out what happens there. Okay, so on Raasay there's another story surrounding the water horse. But basically, when Boswell and Johnson were taking their tour of the Highlands and Islands, they happened to come to a house on Raasay where it was told that the local blacksmith had taken his vengeance upon a water horse that had ate his daughter. He had gone up to his daughter had been at the side of the loch when the water horse had jumped out and dragged her kicking and screaming into the water. This water horse was not the passive hunter that we've come across so far. This is a water horse that has decided to take the issue into its own hand, go hunting. The man was understandably distraught at the loss of his daughter and decides that this water horse has got to go. He basically builds a great big skewer, hides it at the top of a hill. In front of that skewer, he builds a bonfire, and on top of it, he puts a pig. For reasons no known to the water horse, there seems to be nothing better than the smell of a roasting pig. The water horse instantly races out of the water, bounds up the hill, leaps on the pig, and is skewered to death. This dead water horse is then supposed to turn to a jelly-like substance and fade away. Our next location is I think it's Piteush, not quite sure where it is. But basically the story of this one is that the heir of the Baronet of Kincardine, as a young child with his friends, goes down to the water. They are playing by the side of a lock. While playing at the side of a lock, a great big horse with a silver saddle turns up. You would think there's something wrong with this to start off with. However, young and foolish, they think, no, we'll climb on this horse. 7 of them climb on the back of this horse. Already we can see this is quite a long horse. They still don't think anything odd about it. The horse then races towards the water in true style. The heir is the only person to escape from the horse when he cuts off his own fingers that were attached to the reins, leaving his fellow playmates to their fate as they're dragged off to the depths. Tales like this can also be found throughout the rest of the Highlands. They can also be found in the Faroe Islands. There is a tradition in the Faroe Islands of water horses being used for building projects. And one village decides to build a new church. They decide the easiest way of moving the big stones is to drag, get the water horse to drag the stones. The water horse is a big and fearsome beast, but if you can make the sign of the cross over its shoulders, then you have power over it, and it will do your bidding. At the end of a long day, they've got a new church built. The water horse is, for want of a better word, knackered. Absolutely worn out. However, the people of the village think, hey, it's a nice looking horse, why not go for a ride on it? The first person climbs on the horse trots round. Nice gentle horse, everyone is impressed. The second person climbs on the horse, sits behind the first person. This is great. What better feeling than this than traipsing down on a big strong water horse? The third person climbs on the horse. They think it's great. They call across everyone else. Soon the whole village is climbing on the water horse. Well, this is great. There's now 30 people sat on the back of this water horse. Where can you get a stretched water horse? This is it. So good is this people, they decide to take a picnic with them. The later members of the village come up with local snacks and delicacies. Being the Faroe Isles, one of those is whale blubber. So as the water horse is traipsing round the village with the entire population on its back, it suddenly turns nasty. After all, it is a water horse, it can't help itself. It starts to slowly walk towards a local lake. The trouble is, when people try to get off the water horse, they find this stuck. Once again, the water horse has turned to glue. However, they're in luck, because as they are being dragged across to the water, one of the young boys, in his best clothes, because it was a church day, is being offered some blubber. He says, and excuse whatever his language is, Ika, Nika, Meg. And suddenly the water shrinks and everybody falls off. He should have said, well, he thought he was saying, Ika, Sneaker, Meg, which is supposedly, don't smear blubber on my nice clothes. However, because the water horse had understood that it said Nika, which was the name the water horse was known by, it lost its power. After that day, the villagers did not see that water horse again, nor were they ever deft enough to find the water horse for another ride. In Orkney, the number of water horses that were recorded in some areas was incredible. In 1 mile stretch on the Isle of Hoy, there were 3 waterhorses to be found. Think of it as a waterhorse version of a red light zone. No sooner are you walking innocently down the street than the first waterhorse of ill virtue comes up to you, tries to tempt you, flashing its eyes, whispering nice things. A little further down the road, another waterhorse comes to you. A little further down, another annoying waterhorse comes to you. Before you know it, 3 waterhorses have ganged up on you. It's amazing that any traveller ever made it down through the Isle of Hoy without being drowned. Our next location is Loch Craig. In the 1850s, it was said that a stalker, and by stalker we're not talking about somebody who's met you online, who's got a fancy to you, but rather a gentleman who helps you hunting game. He's said to have spotted a waterhorse swimming in the loch. Now, unlike the rest of the waterhorses, this appears to be some kind of animal. What it could be, hard to say. He never got very close to it. A few years later, there would be another waterhorse reported, and this would be from the Isle of Ericsay in the Outer Hebrides. And a farmer by the name of McEwen had gone out one morning to gather his cattle together. And it was a misty morning. He was walking around the loch looking for his missing animals, when he sees something he understands to be his missing the cattle. As he gets closer to it, he realises this is not one of his beasts, but some strange animal. He never really gets close to it. It's still in the mist. The animal makes a screaming noise and heads off to the water. The farmer himself probably makes a screaming noise and heads off for a new pair of trousers. Once he's recovered from his experience, he then goes off to tell the local expert on it. It was a Father Alan, I think MacDonald, and he was collecting tales of folklore and mystery animal, folklore mainly. And he takes this sighting of a waterhorse as being, this sighting as being a waterhorse. And what he was trying to prove was that the waterhorse was a real animal. Now, it is suggested that when he has been reporting this sighting, he has twisted it into what he wanted to report as a waterhorse, rather than some other strange or unrecognised animal. It could have been anything. It could have been a seal. It could have just been he'd scared himself at the side of the loch, seeing one of his animals at a strange angle. It's hard to say, but the person collecting the stories had wanted to prove the waterhorse has existed. Now, personally, I don't think there is such a thing as the shape-shifting little old lady, strange gentleman, waterhorse. It is some kind of tale to warn you away. There are certainly animals reported around the world as waterhorses, which will be flesh and blood animals. There could be mistaken identities, but it's just a generic term for the animal. The ones I've been looking at are the ones from Scottish folklore. Now, in 1937, a gentleman called Alistair Alpine McGregor was writing a book on the folklore and myths of the Highlands and Islands. And he states that just 3 decades before, every location in the Highlands and Islands had a tale of a waterhorse. But by the 1930s, they'd almost disappeared. When I came to start looking at gathering information for the mystery animals of the Western Isles, a book I wrote a couple of years ago, appeals for information about waterhorses. Very few people had heard about them. They had heard of the name, but would not even know that the nearest loch to them had been such a scene of such shocking things as the tale of Dark Mary and Fair Mary. had almost vanished. It's been replaced by much more interesting creatures. It's been replaced by, of all things, werewolves on the island. It's been replaced by sea serpents in the sea, strange birds flying above. But the waterhorse has vanished. Now, I would like to suggest there's a reason why the waterhorse has vanished. And that is because the waterhorse is a health and safety animal. The health and safety animal is the animal that comes out to tell you valuable lessons. It also is a good excuse for tragic events. If we look at the tale of Dark Mary and Fair Mary, is there a better way of saying, do not let a stranger into your shieling at night? It might look like a harmless little old lady, but is that not what you would expect? Is that not the kind of thing that you trust? Is that not the way of warning you of danger? Of the children playing by the lake, the waterhorse had dragged them to the deaths. Well, is this not a tale telling children not to go near the lake? Is this not telling them that if you play near water, the dreaded waterhorse will get you? It's the bogeyman. It's there waiting under the water to drag you to your death. We have perhaps the young gentleman who cuts his own fingers off to save him from being dragged to his death. Does this not seem that it could be warning you that if you take somebody else's horse, there could be consequences? Is it not an early way of warning joyriders of this punishment? Well, we have on Shetland the story of the waterhorse that goes around mills. What kind of health and safety thing could that be telling us? Well, perhaps it's not health and safety in this sense, but we are now telling perhaps a next of kin about a shocking accident. What if the miller has gone out thinking, my wheel has stopped spinning, oh, it's that twig at the back, I'll just put my hand inside it. Only for the wheel to start spinning again and for mashed miller to float out. Is it not better to tell the young children that the miller has run away with the waterhorse, rather than explaining the bag of bones on the floor is all that's left after he's fell into machinery? I would say that if we're looking at the waterhorse today, we would be looking at something resembling this, the modern waterhorse. Certainly, from the 70s onwards, there was a new fear, something shocking that lurked beneath the water. A bicycle frame that would attach itself to your ankles, dragging you to the watery depths. The innocent-looking shopping trolley. You can see these lurking in most rivers. Occasionally in car parks. The amount of people who are fooled into climbing into one of these baskets, only to be pushed along by their so-called friends towards the nearest watercourse. This is what today's waterhorse would look like. These are the things that would lurk. But there's even one more dreaded modern waterhorse. The fridge. Does anybody remember a safety film with a fridge lurking in a quarry? Happy young man swims off down to the fridge. I don't know whether he thought there was some cheese in it. I don't know. But he swims inside only for the door to shut behind him. Is that not the most fearsome of waterhorses? The new Smeg. Now, these are basically what has taken over the story. No longer are we having people being told the horse will get you. It's now more practical things. It's the broken glass in the riverbed. It's the bicycle frame that catches you. It's the shopping trolley that catches you. We don't have stories anymore of the waterhorse coming and stealing children. We now have the stranger in the car, the strange man who will come along and offer to show you his puppies. These are today's versions. There are plenty more things to scare people with now than there used to be. You can look at the media and see enough scary tales, but you no longer need to make the waterhorse to get your points across. Now, that basically brings us to the end of our talk. It's a bit quicker than it was going to be, but I don't want to overrun. However,
You've got plenty of time, mate.
oh, well, I've got plenty more tales, but if anybody's got any questions at this point they'd like to ask.
Yes, I tell you what, Aurelia, can you do me a favour? Can you be my little elf? Because I'm not more talented, right? One. If you can take it up to Steve, if you don't mind me by running around microphone test. I'm trying to think of a better name than running around microphone test.
Yes, it's not really a question, but it's an observation from what you're saying about the modern border. Where I grew up in Manchester, more years than I care to admit to, I remember being told as a kid, don't sit near the grates on the street and don't go near the ponds because Jenny Greenteeth will get you.
Yes.
Which is the language of Waterdeep.
Yeah.
Which is also, I found out years later, Jenny Greenteeth was a local name for duckweed.
Yeah.
Which of course, if you go in, it will drag you down.
Yeah. There is a tale from Cheshire of a mermaid that turns angry. It's very similar to a waterhorse tale, but basically, on this mere at Cumberbatch, there were a couple of workmen taking the new bell for the church across the mere. And halfway across it, for reasons best known, one of the workmen drops the bell on his toe and starts swearing. Not just the odd profanity, but real blasphemy. And Jenny Greenteeth pops out the water, grabs him, drags him into the depths. He's never seen again. When she pops up, takes the bell as well. And again, yeah, it is a name for duckweed. It's strange. In England, we seem to have personalities who lurk in the water, whereas we see in the Highlands and Islands to have an animal who lurks in it. And again, it's suggesting it's a good bogeyman to scare people away, but it's also a good way of explaining tragic deaths. I think it's a good way of getting across to people the danger, but also not exposing them to the shocking truth of what's going on.
Which lake in Cheshire is that story?
That's Cumberbatch. That's on the Shropshire border. There is also a similar tale told from Oscar and Mere. That mermaid's a bit nicer.
There's actually an identical one from Martin Mere in Lancashire.
Yeah, every mere. And meres are not particularly deep. They're not particularly... you're not talking the Great Lakes. You're talking somewhere it's a nice fishing resort. And the idea that there could be something lurking beneath the waves, we generally refer to mermaids stealing bells, or, for example, Rossford Mere, we're talking at one stage stretching 75 miles, which today would make it at least a mile deep had it done such a thing.
Now, something Richard, in one of the quiz questions yesterday, he asked the question, which of these bodies of water did not have a lake tradition? The answer being Rutland Water, which is only about 30 years old. But my question is going to be, how long does Rutland Water have to be there before it has a something in the depths, lurking in the depths tradition?
I would say today it will take no longer than 3 days on the website.
Yeah. Because
if you look at an example, there's a very good website, the Paranormal Database. Now, it's great, it's absolutely brilliant. If you get a chance to look at it, it really is good. Well worth looking at. Bloke who runs it, ask him a couple of questions, gets back dead quick to you. Anything you want. But once it has made it onto the internet, you'll be amazed how soon it becomes real. It has to be real. For example, the Isle of Lewis suddenly acquired werewolves. It could have only acquired werewolves from 1980 onwards, and yet the tradition would suggest it had been going for a long time. The werewolves seem to turn up in a book by Terence Whitaker, copying some information that had been lifted from Elliot O'Donnell. Up to that point, however, before the internet, very few people would have known that. As soon as it gets onto the internet, it suddenly becomes, well, it must be real, it's there. If you've got a nice picture with it, it's definitely there. It doesn't matter how ridiculous the claim is. So if we wanted to make Rutland Water the most dangerous place to go, we could certainly do that by the end of tomorrow.
Have you also noticed that every... sorry, Marky. We've got plenty of time, so I'm feeling garrulous this morning. I'm quite happy for this to go on as long as it does. Have you noticed that in the same way as there are lake monster traditions and sort of associated things in many of the big lakes, every village pond's got the biggest pike you've ever seen, or the enormous perch that bites the legs of ducklings, or it seems like every body of water we have to
Well,
populate.
certainly it's the easiest place. To be honest, nearly every body of water where we're living at the moment has turtles in it. And they have been released in the last few years. But it's the terrible turtle. It's gone from being a happy little terrapin to a snapping turtle. It's there ready to take, not your toe off, your whole leg. It's increased in scale. No one's seen it, but as soon as that story starts going, there's even bodies of water in Cheshire that are supposed to house crocodiles now. But again, nobody will have seen it. Well, once that story starts, it will carry on.
This was not a setup, but you're talking about crocodiles. It's a project we're starting, and if there's anybody in the North Devon area who wants to help us, you have stories every summer from waterways across the country, particularly Cheshire and particularly Gloucestershire for some reason, of there being crocodiles that are supposed to have been released there. Now, I think it's probably once every few years somebody smuggles back a baby alligator from a Florida holiday, and when it causes a nasty gash that needs stitches, they chuck it into a local pond. It happens occasionally, but there was no way could any crocodilian survive a British winter. It is just not at all feasible. I've heard theories that in some of the canals in the Midlands, well, that area of water is heated by the local power plant or thing, but I think it's highly unlikely that there are any crocodiles that live for more than maybe a month or so in a British waterway. What I think people are seeing is pike, because pike, as I've said over and over again this weekend, we're getting, as society, we're getting more and more divorced from the natural world. Whereas when I was a boy, me and my friends just spent all summer. We'd only come in for meals, we'd be roaming over the fields, catching butterflies, looking at frogs, fishing, doing all that stuff. Most kids don't these days, especially ones in the city. And so you have just several successive generations of people who don't know the natural world. And as pike can grow considerably larger than other common British fish, and as they are long, thin and angular with sort of armoured heads, I'm pretty sure that people are seeing pike basking in the sun. Now Max, at great personal expense, got us a pike. Great personal expense when he went to the local garden centre and sold British fish and bought one for us. But in the big show tank up in what is euphemistically described as our museum, which until we get some more funding could more reasonably describe as a converted chicken shed full of rubbish, there is a large tank with a pike in. I'm looking for some local volunteers who fancy taking their thermos flask and their cheese sandwiches up and one of our digital cameras and photographing this damn thing once I've fixed up the basking light from every conceivable angle to see if we can get a digital photograph of our pike that we know perfectly well is a pike and see if it looks like a crocodile. That's a piece of practical research that if anybody is interested in doing that, come and see me up. I'll be on the front desk over the rest of the day. Sorry that was interrupted, Glen.
No problem.
Sorry.
Was there any more questions?
Yes, indeed. I've been hanging on to this microphone, thinking certain persons would never dry up. With regard to water monsters making people pregnant, exactly the same thing is supposed to happen in the Amazon. There you have weremen. I don't mean, yes, they are dolphins that turn into humans rather than humans that turn into dolphins. These dolphins are supposed to come ashore looking like humans and wearing white suits, and I'm told they're very good at playing the saxophone. Now, the thing is, if one of these things, they are called the boto, if a boto makes a girl pregnant, she doesn't have any social problems, because the general belief is the boto has hypnotic powers and it's not her fault. So if you ever get pregnant in the region of the Amazon and you want to keep it quiet who the father is, just say it was the boto and dried. Now the other thing I wanted to mention, you said that things like Jenny Greenteeth, these were warnings to keep children away from the edge of lakes, and I agree they probably generally were. But I have come on a tale that is very macabre and is supposedly true, that occurred in Somerset in recent times. Now, I won't tell people what it is just now, but if you come to my lecture this afternoon at 3:45, that's the one not to miss. You'll hear the full tale, and I'll tell you, it'll curl the hairs on the back of your neck. Thank you. Richard, you had a question as usual.
I found a story of a crocodile in the late 18th century, somewhere called Kirkleatham, I think is off the Cleveland coast. And I also found a story of a pike that's supposed to have killed somebody in somewhere in southern England, sometime in the mid-19th century.
Christoph.
I'm sorry, Mark, I'm not forgetting.
Yes, all the places you refer to were colonised by Vikings back in the 9th and 10th century, and many of the names you put up for the waterhorse suggest Norse words.
Yeah.
Is it possible that the origin of these stories come from Scandinavia?
There would definitely be a strong hint to Scandinavia. Some of them are very generic as you work your way through the islands. Certainly, the stories of horses from Orkney and Shetland. As you go further up, your water horses in Shetland are vaguely more Norse than your ones in Orkney. By the time you get to the Faroe Isles, these are more following the Norse tradition, and we compare quite well to the stories from Iceland, where the water horse is being used as a beast of burden. Certainly, the tales would also have more of an heroic element into it as well. They've gone from being just people dying, being more into the hero comes to kill the water horse or interact with it. I think the only one that I see as being slightly of a different tradition is the bull and the water horse. That seems to be more of a Celtic tradition, some kind of animal contest. But the location of that is a lot further south. In theory, would have had less Norse influence, but certainly, as you work your way up the islands, it certainly gets more and more Norse. Certainly, the way the stories have been remembered.
Actually, the contest with the bull, that is a very Norse thing. Yeah.
Oh, in that case, it's an Norse one.
Yeah. In Scandinavia, they have legends of a creature called a lindor, which is like a giant serpentine beast that comes out of lakes and crushes churches. kills people and so forth. And there's a tradition in Scandinavian countries where they take a bull calf and feed it on milk, even after it's been weaned, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger till it's an enormous great elephantine thing. And then they send it out to fight the lindorm, and they invariably end up killing each other. I think usually the lindorm swallows the bull, and then the horns pierces. Yeah. So that this bull motive, fighting the bull, is very definitely Scandinavian.
It could make sense. Again.
Oliver. Now, Mark, can you film Oliver asking the question? We'll go back to the
I was wondering if you'd heard any stories of waterhorses that are benevolent or even helpful to people. Because I know there's one or two in the Welsh tradition. There's a story about a waterhorse with a rider who is spotted glowing, actually physically glowing in the night near a town called Flemingston, and actually warns a guy to go up from the valley back up into the village because there's a flood coming. The flood comes and the guy is actually saved by the intervention of this waterhorse.
There is a story from the Isle of Skye where the old widow, her only child, dies. And that night she's in her little hovel and a stranger comes up to the house. He's a well-dressed Highland gent. He comes into the house. He has all the hallmarks of being a waterhorse. He sits down by the fire and all night talks to the old woman, keeps her company, keeps the spirits up and stokes the fire. And it doesn't matter how few embers are left in the fire. He sticks his cane into the fire, whispers a small charm to it, only for it to burst back into flame again. Certainly that's what I'm most familiar with of it being a benevolent waterhorse. I suspect there's a few more, but not as entertaining as the one I used, if I'm honest.
Okay, I'll just stop over the camera.
Hi. I was quite interested because Chris has just sort of picked up on the point of the Norse, but I was thinking how far the horses from Scotland down to when you get to sort of northern England, where they start turning into sort of nymphs, fairies, and witches. But in Dorset we have a similar type of horse, which is called the Colpexi, which is an orchard guardian, and in Hampshire I think they've got one as well. And we've had stories where they've done similar of what they call throwing the rider, which is into one of the local rivers. And because I was just thinking with the Vikings, because we've had the evidence of all the skeletons that were found nearby where I live, whether that could be an influence with the Vikings that way.
I think there's certainly a strong influence of the Vikings. I suspect it's how long the Viking influence stayed in the area. I think the influence would have had to have stayed after probably the 11th century. Because there should be quite a strong tradition of waterhorses in northern England, and yet there seems to be more of a tradition of the strange woman in the water.
Yeah.
Whereas certainly the Western Isles and the Northern Isles would be heavily influenced by a Norse tradition, certainly from the 13th century and onwards. So I think the idea certainly would be introduced to an area, and it's certainly interesting to see a comparison of Norse sites to the tradition of the waterhorse, and also to look at the variations, because I think there is a tradition around the world of some kind of waterhorse. It's how you then transfer that. Certainly in the Western Isles it's a shape-changing animal, whereas in Orkney and Shetland it's more of a fixed animal. That could be the influence of later settlements. It twists the stories to suit how it best sees it, whereas the more Norse-derived areas would stick to a more traditional element certainly something I'm looking into, and I say hopefully in a few years' time I will have all my waterhorse findings ready for publication somewhere.
I mean, it's interesting because William Barnes, who's a local dialect, he actually wrote in his book or collection of words, Thoughts of Dialect, that Colpexy was an actual word for scrumping, which is, I suppose, warding people off of you know, taking apples from the orchard, or you know, the Colpexy would get you. And there has been sort of stories, folk stories, where you know the dangers of actually stealing apples from an orchard. So it's got that same element to it.
Yeah, it's definitely something I'll be looking into, because it's definitely a tradition, and it's sadly a dying tradition. There's less and less of these tales being recorded. Certainly, it appeared it's only the older generation knows of them.
Yeah.
They're dying out. It's almost as if nobody needs to be told anymore. Perhaps you don't. I'm looking forward to the rioting and looting waterhorse that comes to sort you out if you go and steal something.
John Hare and then Simon.
I was wondering if there's a couple of things. There's the stranger legend of I think every culture has a legend of someone knocks on the door and come in and seem perfectly normal, and then in the middle of the night they transform into something. I know Samadra's the orange Jadian tiger wear type of thing.
Yeah.
Knocks on the door, you know, in the village, comes in, and then slaughters everybody in the night, find dead bodies everywhere. But one thing I was wondering with the way in English lakes, it seems to be a more nebulous fear, the Jenny Green Teeth thing, a kind of transformative spirit, or a kind of, but it's the same kind of idea of warning. So the actual animals in the Isles, is that because you're near a water, I mean ocean? You're surrounded by ocean, you've got big animals in the ocean.
It wouldn't appear to be. I suspect a lot to do with the nature of an area. You would be such a small community. I can't imagine them saying it's the creepy man around the corner you've got to watch out for.
I don't mean that so much. Yeah, I don't mean that so much, but just that there is a legitimate fear of big animals in the water if you're living by the sea. You're seeing big animals. Whereas in a small lake, you're probably not seeing humpbacks coming up and things.
Yeah,
you know, whales.
Some of there's certainly things in the waters around the Northern Isles and Western Isles that would never have you on the beach.
Yeah.
There's certainly tales from the last 100 years of big serpentine necks appearing out of the water and trying to eat people.
You get killer whales on there, don't you, as well, and things?
Yeah, there's certainly killer whales to be seen. I say plenty of big beasts that were said to lurk in some of the lakes, big worm creatures that would appear, but they were quite distinct from the waterhorse. The waterhorse was attracted to people. The big worms had come out and eat sheep, and there's a definite link. It was definitely not a place to be in the past. You would not want to walk near the beach, you wouldn't want to walk near the lake, possibly crossroads to be avoided. It really wasn't a place to go out the doors. So how much of that would have been at the time people would have really believed, because you would have never have gone out indoors, and you certainly wouldn't have been invited anybody in.
Oh, mate, I grew up in the Orkneys and he said it actually was a nightmare anyway. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, also talking of Viking influence, there's the Manx thing about the waterfall, the Tara Ushti, which I think is similarly predatory, and traditions of lake cattle, although I think at Bach, where the fairy lady leads the cows out of the lake, there's certainly more like a benign herd, whereas I think the Tara Ushti is more predatory.
There are stories from St Kilda of water bulls appearing. Some of them are miniature bulls that appear. Some are responsible for genetic defects in your herd. It's almost the...
You blame your sickly cow on that?
Yeah, blame your sickly cow on the frisky water bull that's appeared. if certain one of the signs was if your cow only had very small ears, it's almost certain it was related to a waterhorse that turned up one night.
There's supposed to be otherworld colour as well, so the white animal with red ears, like cows are.
Some of them appear not exactly multicoloured, but different variations on.
Do you find that in the Western Isles, the white with the red ears?
Not necessarily. I couldn't honestly tell you off the top of my head. It will be in my book though, it's still available to buy.
The other thing about the pitiful old woman, there's an overlap with the Kanyek there, the hag, Fiddly the hunter, and defeats the giants, and then the last one of all is the pitiful old woman, and she says we chain the dogs up, and he chains the dogs up with the hair, and the hair turns to an iron chain and restrains the dogs. And that's also a story found in the Caucasus about the pitiful old woman. Again, the hair of the dog.
I would keep well away from old ladies.
Dangerous.
You see me, Marks and Spencer's going for a bargain.
Oh.
It's all elbows and teeth.
Young ladies can be pretty dangerous as well. There are a few around here, I did a chariot.
I'm intrigued by the story about the offal floating up. And there was a point about the killer whales. I was wondering whether sometimes the explanation is perhaps a killer whale, or I know makos occasionally make their way into the Scottish sort of lochs. Attacked by one of them with a rider, with a horse, because obviously falling in, that could create commotion. What do you think about that?
Certainly the areas where the offal has floated up have been inland lochs.
Right.
It's interesting, it's always a variation in offal. And it was only when I was writing down exactly which offals from which sites had turned up, but it struck me it is almost certainly the ingredients for haggis. It's only missing a few oats and a few spices, and a bag, and it's there. And the stories are quite sure of which bits floated up as well. It's from Skye, it is definitely the lung, and the lung appears with the heart. The liver appears different places. It's never the liver appears and a shattered limb. It is only one part. And I've always been curious how it decides, I don't fancy that. You'd think if it was avoiding liver, does it have a preference on sprouts? Does it have a very set menu? It really doesn't want to eat certain stuff.
It's interesting, going back to the Boto as well, is interesting that myth originated when missionaries first came in. It was supposedly an explanation as to why some rather pale-looking babies were born. And it was interesting, similar thing about explaining embarrassing or unfortunate events.
I think it's handy.
Position on this. Well, I'm finding this awfully interesting.
Anybody else? We have silence. And Aurelia, my dear, thank you. You can sit back and think.
Well,
Greg, you can do the running around now.
Bull collection and floating offal. There's there's traditional bait for a really big Vels catfish, supernatural associations, was the lungs of a bull put on a giant hook, pulling out a monster in the deep, specifically with lungs, is something it was attracted to.
It'll be interesting, certainly to see if there's a tradition for the area of using offal as bait for different animals, whether that can then be tied into settlement of the region. It's another thing I'll be looking into. Certainly, your questions have all been great. They're definitely pointers to projects I'm working on. But I'm trying to record as many waterhorse tales and basically any reasons they could be. And certainly trying to overlap sightings, stories, to population spread, and then possibly hunting traditions in those areas. We'll be interested to see how well actually, I suspect suspect would be quite a good match in a lot of locations. Certainly where the point the waterhorse stops being a horse and starts turning into the hidden beast under the water, or the woman we fancy who works on rugby. It will certainly be plenty of leads to go into.
What if there's an element of the triple death of Celtic triplicity and the threefold thing, the lungs, the heart and the liver?
Again, I think the trouble is, and you do come across this with some stories, some of the previous authors, when they've come to record information, have added a bit to it. And I think there is a danger that we've added some bits of offal to spice up the story. That basically...
I think it's usually a single...
Yeah, it's been some way to, I say, make it more interesting, make it more scary. Again, it's something we'd have to compare the different authors. Certainly, some of the authors who've reported stuff have vivid imaginations. It's probably a good way of putting it. And they have a tendency to spice up the stories.
Well, guys, I always hate doing this. I always hate having to pull the plug on what is a really interesting discussion, because I can think of at least half a dozen other tangents that this could go. It's one of the things I particularly like about the Weird Weekend on Sunday, is that you've got time then to overrun and go where the conversation takes you. However, I have got to pull the plug, because in a very few moments we're going to have our next speaker on. But before we do, I feel very, very embarrassed. I worked very hard with Glen to get his new book, Mr. Allen's The Northern Isles, out. It was supposed to be out at the beginning of last week. Unfortunately, through a collection of technical problems and the fact that the printers lost the DVD I sent them, it's actually going to come out tomorrow. I'm very sorry, Glen, I did try. Next time we have you coming to launch the book, we'll get the book done by 3 months in advance, so we make sure we get it right. It's an absolutely cracking book. It'll be up on Amazon within the next couple of weeks. I don't know how many of you have read Glen's first book, Mr. Allen's of the Western Isles. It's an absolute cracker, but I tell you what, the new one, Mr. Allen's of the Northern Isles, knocks it into a cocked hat. It's an absolutely brilliant book. About 18 months ago, I got this email from this bloke, just after we started doing the blog on a daily basis. Email from this guy, saying, "Oh, can I write your article for the blog, and do you want me to do a book on Mr. Allen's of the Western Isles?" I've never heard of him. But I said, yes, of course. He gave me a ring, and again, it was another one of those telephone conversations that should have lasted 2 minutes, and went on for about 2.5 hours, and I immediately knew this man was a kindred spirit. Well, my initial suspicions were completely confirmed, because I cannot imagine running the CFZ without this guy. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Glen Vaudrey.
Well, I'd just like to say thanks for turning up.
Can I have Richard and Henry?